All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to City Hall for our human trafficking presentation. In case, I pretty much know everybody here, but just in case there's somebody I don't know, I am Chief Haynes. I'm the police chief for the city and also the deputy city manager. We have several dignitaries in our presence this evening. This particular human trafficking seminar is being put on by the city of Madison Heights, but our Madison Heights Crime Commission as well. So just to get some introductions with us here tonight, and I apologize if I butcher somebody's name, don't mean to, but we have Mayor Rosalind Grafstein, back of the room. We have Councilor Quinn Wright. We have Councilwoman Toya Aaron with us. And let's see, we have obviously right in my front row, because I'm looking all the way to the back, we have Councilman Sean Fleming here as well. Councilman Fleming is also part of the Crime Commission. So, Crime Commission members, we have our chairperson, Martha Covert. We have one of our newest members, Beth Scott. We have, I'm gonna forget, right here, Ali Iaquinto. Okay, got it, made it. That was close. All right, and we have Peggy Maritet at the back of the room. So, again, thank you for coming this evening. And a brief introduction. I'm not going to take up a whole bunch of your time with it, but our speakers for this evening are Sergeant Craig White. He's been with the department for too many years already. I can't even count how many he's been there. I think the FBI mentioned today that it was like 100, probably. So, but anyway, he has been just a huge asset to the city of Madison Heights, and he has worked in several different divisions within the department, but most recently, aside from his reassignment to road patrol, he spent a lot of time in our undercover unit, our special investigations unit. And what is really super impressive about Sergeant White is that we realized here in Oakland County, Madison Heights specifically, that we did have a real human trafficking issue with all the hotels and some of the apartment complexes that we have in the city. And Sergeant White took this and just ran with it to try to save the victims of what we're seeing from human trafficking. He's done a fantastic job. But a couple of the things that he did do is we started inundating the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office with these cases, and everybody kind of looked at it, well, there's prostitution, and maybe it's just that, and you know, is that really a crime? But then they realized, well, wait a minute, these aren't actual victims of human trafficking. So the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office, in response to what we were doing, created their own unit at the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office to handle specifically human trafficking, again, thanks to our SIU. And a great contribution from Allison Mercer, who is a victim advocate from Common Ground. She has been sensational, and we started the first actual combination of a combined group within Madison Heights, but the first one in the state of Michigan, and probably it might even be national, the first time that law enforcement has gotten together with a victim advocate service and actually embedded them with our team, so that when we go out, they're not like the first responder to where they go into the situation, but as soon as the situation is safe and everybody is in custody or taken away from the situation, we're able to get Allison with the victims of the crimes, and it's just been sensational. So without saying a whole lot more, I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant White and Allison, and I hope you enjoy the topic and learn something tonight about human trafficking.
Great. Thanks, Chief. Appreciate that. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. Appreciate you being here. Just to go expound a little bit on what the Chief talked about with our collaboration between Madison Heights and Common Ground. One of the things that we experienced early on in around 2019 was that our group could identify traffickers. We could identify victims. And when we say, we're going to use two terms. We're going to use the term victim, and we're going to use the term survivor throughout this presentation. A victim is somebody that we haven't made contact with. A survivor is somebody that we get into a program and then goes through services that Allison Mercer and her group has to offer. So if you hear victim or survivor, that's how we use that interchangeably, but it's before we make contact and after we make contact is the difference. The problem we faced in 2019 was not identifying cases and identifying traffickers and identifying victims. It was getting the victim maintaining contact with the victim after we initially made that first approach or first contact with that person. If nobody knows this in this room, in order to successfully charge and prosecute somebody for human trafficking, you need a victim. So you can't go through the entire process of making somebody accountable unless a victim is there to testify at some point. Maybe not early on in the case, but at some point, the person that's accused or being charged has the right to face his accuser. So if that person's not available, it becomes an issue with us. And that's the problem we were having. We were losing our victim at some point throughout the process, and the case was being dropped. So traffickers know this. It's something they use to their advantage. They're very good at controlling their victim and making sure that they don't show up to court or cooperate with us. When Allie came into the picture, when we teamed up, we changed our approach. And as you see through some of these slides, we'll explain it a little bit more in detail later on. Victims are generally afraid of the police, and you're going to see that as we go along here. And we noticed that right away. We knew it was a problem, and we tried to come up with a way to combat that. And that was bringing Allie in right from the beginning. So once we secured the scene, Allie was brought in. She was the point of contact for that victim. So from that point forward, we took a hands-off approach with that person. And Allie stepped in, she took over, and treatment began on her end, and then it allowed us to focus more on the trafficker end and getting that case prepared for court. What we noticed is the victim, soon to be a survivor, was sticking around. Now we had them with us for the entire program. So we need to get past that initial hump of getting that person through a program, through treatment, because as you know, as most of you know, a lot of our victims and survivors, they're dependent on narcotics a lot of times. So that's a big hurdle for us. And if Allie can assist getting them through that part of the process, it makes our job a lot easier. Right?
Yeah.
Pretty much covered? Okay, good.
Yeah. All right, so we'll start with some pretty generic, just to get the ball rolling about what the legal situation is, but human trafficking is essentially labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion. You only need to prove one of them legally. You don't actually need all three. For the purpose of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery, or any commercial sex act where the victim is under 18, regardless of whether any force, fraud, or coercion is involved. You only need force, fraud, or coercion for an adult victim. For minors, you don't have to follow the same guidelines. We kind of always jump into this because this is a question we get asked a lot. Not all people who are involved in sex work are trafficking victims. And not all trafficking victims have ever had sex work on the side first. So they're not equivalent to each other. It does overlap sometimes, but just because you see one doesn't mean it automatically leads to the other. There's two elements that are different in someone who works as a sex worker versus someone who is being sex trafficked, and that's choice and control. So they have more autonomy over what they decide to do. I always will say I have never met someone who originally started doing sex work by their choice because it was the number one thing they wanted to do in life. I've never met someone who said, that's all I wanted to do. Normally it was life circumstances where, you know, they didn't have other opportunities or privileges, and that's what ended up occurring. Everyone always asks about stats, so we always throw some slides in here about statistics, but I will say trafficking is extremely underreported. A lot of crimes in general, when it comes to victimization, are underreported for various different reasons. But this is just to give a general idea. Polaris is the only national agency that is taking statistics on trafficking in the United States. And just to give a general idea, the types of trafficking, so they've documented escort services, pornography, illicit massage, health and beauty, residential-based, or personal servitude. Recruiter types, we will go into this more, but every training I ever do, I always tell people, stranger danger is a great training for your kids, but it's not the only training they should be getting. A lot of people think, it's the white van that pulls up and kidnaps people off the street. And I'm not going to say that it's never happened, but most likely that is not what is happening more often. So it's really important to know family members, caregivers, intimate partners, and employers, especially when it comes to labor trafficking. Recruitment locations where traffickers find victims essentially can be the internet, like a dating site. It does happen on the street. Facebook, social media in general is a big one, especially with COVID. And then risk factors, we will go into a lot more risk factors than that. And then this is just a comparison of recruiter types. So the number one recruiter type for labor trafficking tends to be an employer, right? That's where you get, and we'll go into it more, but that's where you get the identification, or maybe they don't have status, they don't speak the language. So you'll get an employer more likely for labor trafficking, and then the most common is family caregiver for sex trafficking. This is the most recent Michigan stat we have, and I will tell you this number is probably extremely low. This is just the last time they did statistics by state in the United States, and Michigan, they said they had 364. That's probably extremely low. Also, labor trafficking is very underreported for even more reasons than sex trafficking. So labor trafficking is more common. We just talk about sex trafficking more. So some myths to go over, because a lot of people do think this, and it's okay, but we're going to tell you today that it's not true. Only females can be victims or survivors of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. Males can be sex trafficked. Sex workers and trafficking are the same thing. It is not true that traffickers target people they don't know. It happens sometimes, but keep in mind, someone who's talked to someone online for 3 months might not be considered a stranger anymore. Victims always want to be rescued. That is a big thing. We law enforcement, I allow to use the term rescued. They truly do. As an advocate, I don't rescue people. I help people. But they don't always want to be rescued, essentially. And we'll go into the reasons of that, because, getting help, we'll go into it more, but it's not as easy as you think to all of a sudden uproot your entire life and get clean and reconnect with your family and figure out where your kids are. There's a lot of barriers to getting help. Victims are physically unable to leave their situation. I think a lot of people think of, the chained in the basement or the locks on the inside of the house. I have seen people locked in places before. It does happen, but again, that's not the most common. They might be physically able to leave, but there's a lot of different barriers as to why they can't. Another myth is that only undocumented foreign nationals get trafficked in the United States. It is not just migrants or people, on visas or green cards. It absolutely happens to U.S. citizens. It happens to people that grew up in Southeast Michigan that are from our areas. That happens more than people think. And that people think human trafficking only happens in illegal or underground industries. It does, but it happens in legal industries like hotels. Massage parlors that on the front might look legal, but what they're doing behind the scenes is illegal. Correct. I was like, anything else? So we'll break down different types of force, fraud, and coercion just to help clarify what those terms mean. The first one is kidnapping, torture, battering. Threats with weapons is extremely common, whether the weapon is actually visible or not. Being threatened with a weapon is still terrifying. Sexual abuse, confinement, forced use of drugs, denial of medical care, also very common, and branding and tattooing. We do get branding and tattooing, or I had a case recently where the trafficker bought them all matching necklaces. So they weren't tattooed, but that's how others knew that you were mine. I went backwards. Different types of fraud include promises of immigration documents. So that's a big thing that they use with migrants coming over for work. Wooing into romantic relationships. We have an example of this later, but this essentially means, someone starts off as a great partner, right? I'll buy you this, I'll take you on these dates, I'll treat you the way you should be treated. And then there's a change. Misrepresentation of working conditions. Maybe you're working different hours than you thought, or you're not in safe conditions. I don't know if you guys watch the news, but there's been a lot about minor children that are working, like labor working in factories, labor trafficking in like meat packing industries and stuff. That's pretty common. Promise jobs different from what they were actually doing. So, hey, you're going to work on the farm from, 9 to 5. What they end up doing is, maybe they are working on a farm, but they are working 16-hour days. And then they sleep, they wake up, they only get breakfast. Like, it's different from what they were told they were going to be doing. Withholding wages is a big one. Hey, come over. This might be labor trafficking, but come work for me and I'll put you up in a place, but I'll get you a job. And then all of a sudden you're working the job and you think you're on your feet and they're like, oh, but you owe me for that rent those first 2 months. And so you're just you can't catch up. You can't make enough money to get out of the situation. And then the promise of a better life is huge, especially for people that, might not have grown up in the best situation, whatever their family life was. Maybe they had prior abuse in their life. The promise of, I will love you, I'll treat you the right way, I'll treat you how you should be treated. People who have never been, grew up in a way where they were loved and supported are going to go seek that elsewhere. And they don't know, for the most part, especially if they saw, parents or whoever was in their life that was raising them, how they treated people, they might think that that's how they should be treated. So no one really teaches children growing up how you should be loved unless they have a proper example. So it's kind of a cycle in a sense. Coercion, debt bondage, that's that example I gave to about, come work for me, I'll put you up in an apartment, let you get on your feet the first couple months, and then all of a sudden, oh, you owe me for that rent, by the way. Oh, you owe me for those groceries. You just can't get out of it. The debt just continues to accumulate. Control of children, this is a sad one, but it's true. People that have children with their trafficker, but the justice system doesn't realize it, family court doesn't, maybe trafficker is making more money, has a stable living condition, victim/survivor doesn't. And so trafficker has rights to the kids. And then the survivor is the one that's really trying to get the kids back. Emotional abuse, also extremely common. Threats of harm to victim or family. A lot of survivors I've worked with will say, well, honestly, I can handle a lot. It doesn't matter what happens to me, but don't hurt my family. Don't hurt my kids. Don't hurt my dog, whatever it is. And so, that ability to know maybe where mom lives, dad lives, what type of dog you have, when you let them out at night, like all that type of stuff is a very valid fear if you know that person can be violent. Withholding ID or travel documents, this happens in labor and sex trafficking. I get sex trafficking cases where they also have no identification, no birth certificate, no ID, no social security card, and you would be amazed how hard it is to prove you are who you say you are without any documentation to do so. Verbal and emotional abuse, again, is a form of coercion, and then controlling communication is a huge one. We've had a case together where we can talk to the survivor, but we know the phone's on speaker. The trafficker's listening, right? So you better not say, hey, I'm in the hotel over here, come get me, or ask for help because your trafficker's right there. Or they're the one actually texting you back. So they might be using the phone, or they're only allowed to use the phone at certain times. Everything is essentially being monitored. And then deportation threats, that's a big one for immigrants, right? They came here for the promise of an American dream, right? So they're leaving for a reason. If they're escaping or they're trying to seek asylum here, it might be dealing with what's going on in the U.S. and how they're being treated here might sound better to them than going back to whatever country they came from based on what they're running from. So threats of deportation is a really big one in labor trafficking too.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is, I don't know if we covered it or not, is you don't need force, fraud, or coercion if it involves a juvenile. So none of that is required. Just so we're clear on that. That's only for adults.
Right. So these are the legal definitions. Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion for those above 18. Another stat, honestly, 95% of sex trafficking is done by someone who's already built a relationship with a victim, right? It's not the stranger on the street. It's, someone who maybe they've been talking to for weeks on Facebook, someone they met through a family friend. It's not so much, again, the stranger. Don't be afraid of the stranger. Be afraid of the people that are in your circle, honestly. Not to freak you out, I'm just being honest. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services. And this comes in very different forms. You get it in agriculture, domestic work, hotels, restaurants, construction, hair and nail salons, massage parlors. And this is not all of them. This is just a list of a few of them. I will say, just to clarify too, because it does say transportation, and that can be a part of it, but you do not have to transport someone over like jurisdiction lines or city lines or county lines or even across states for them to be a trafficking victim. You can be from Madison Heights and be trafficked in Madison Heights. You know, you don't have to be changed cities, jurisdictions, whatever, for it to occur to you. It's not the same thing as smuggling. This is just labor trafficking again. More likely they're promised like a higher paying job, education opportunities, travel opportunities, that visa or green card. And a lot of times they're subjected to horrible working conditions, jobs that are different from what they're promised, long hours with little or no pay, and a lot of psychological control. And here's, and again, this is an old stat, 2017, but it just talks about the venues where trafficking can occur. So sex and labor, and then them separately. So for sex trafficking, the most common is escort services, and sex and labor trafficking can occur in illicit massage, health, and beauty. So it's just, there's a lot of different places it can occur. I forgot to say, if anyone has a question while I'm talking, by the way, feel free to raise your hand. You don't have to wait till the end. Yes. Yes. So these are just some vulnerable populations to trafficking. People who have been a victim of childhood sexual abuse or a prior victim in general. You know, maybe they've been in a domestic violence relationship, maybe they've been assaulted. Substance use is a big one. Mental health, also a big one. Anything that can be used by a trafficker against you, they pretty much search for. Runaway homeless youth population or adults, immigrant refugees and asylum seekers, low income, children in foster care, the LGBTQ plus population, and then invisible populations. I always consider people who identify as prostitutes or sex workers as the invisible populations. You know, they go under the radar. People think, oh, that's what they want to be doing. You know, if they were given all the options in the world, they would still stay doing what they're doing. Most likely they wouldn't. And a lot of people, you know, if they turn up missing, you know, they're really underreported. People don't know that they've disappeared. This is more or less kind of a medical slide when we talk to healthcare professionals, but physical signs of trafficking, it can include bite marks, missing teeth, burns, bruises, or cuts, malnourishment. That can be really common, especially in substance use cases. Untreated wounds, STDs, broken and fractured bones. So this is stuff that you would see more physical, but especially in a healthcare setting. So indicators of trafficking, because I know a lot of people wonder, well, what can I do? You know, what can I look for? It's common for people not to have many personal possessions, or if they do have personal possessions, they do not want to let them go. A lot of treatment facilities, you know, only allow people 1 or 2 duffel bags, but when you have someone who's been carrying 8 bags with them, but that's the only thing they've had with them for 10 years, that stuff means a lot to them. They're not allowed to speak for themselves. Another healthcare setting thing, you'll say, you know, don't ever talk to the person sitting next to the patient in a bed, talk to the patient. If you don't speak the language, get a translator. Don't use a family member to translate, because how do you even know they're a family member? No control over ID, including the birth certificate ID, passport, social security card. Sometimes they take it, sometimes they rip it up. They don't have control over money. They don't have financial records. I will say traffickers are really good, you know, again, in the wooing romantic relationship stage of, you know, oh, let's share bank accounts. Oh, put me on your Cash App, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden they're destroying people's credit. And so, again, imagine having horrible credit and trying to do anything. Inconsistency of stories is normal. A lot of people, you know, back in the day used to say, oh, well, all of a sudden this detail changed and they're lying. No, inconsistency of stories is really common, especially when people have gone through trauma. Loss of sense of time, depending on, you know, what times they're working or how little of sleep they're getting or their substance use, mental health, whatever, they might not really have a good sense of time. They might not know where they are. They might not be from the area. lack of knowledge of how to take care of themselves. Some of the things we do is to teach people how to budget, how to grocery shop, like really basic things, but you would think, if no one's taught them that, how would you know? I mean, most public schools don't teach people stuff like that, unfortunately. So sometimes they don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to dress for the weather. Their hygiene might be poor just because they're not used to it. So this slide I'll leave up. I know now it looks really small for you guys. Do you need me to read this? I was going to just put a couple of these slides up for you guys to read, but it does look really small from here. Okay, I will summarize. So Romeo pimps is a type of trafficker. This is the wooing into romantic relationships. This is what I described earlier. A man or woman meets a partner and they treat him the right way. They take him out to dinner. They buy him things. Maybe they've never been in a relationship where someone treated them that way, right? So it really seems like finally I found someone who's treating me how I should be treated. And then something changes, right? But they always have in their mind, no matter how horrible they are down the road, maybe I can get back to that stage where they were really good. Maybe I need to be nicer to them. Maybe I need to do something else. So they use that against them. That is not just trafficking to like domestic violence cases. It's really common. So the coercion or control under that is that he keeps all the money she earns and tells her that he's saving for them to buy a house. We've had a case like that too. Go make enough money and we're going to invest it in daughter, right? We're going to buy her stuff for Christmas. We're going to get that house we always wanted. Okay, but that money never ends up there, right? Another type this is just an online example. So this is why with social media and not just kids, I think even adults need a lot more training in social media, but the recruitment and grooming, it just says a lonely, insecure teen or adult dreams of a modeling career and frequently posts pictures of herself striking a pose. She's contacted by someone who claims to be a modeling agent and sends her a plane ticket to come to his studio. When she arrives, he takes her out on the town and tells her that she has to be nice to some people in the business to get contacts and sends her out to prostitute. So the coercion and control there is she's far from home. She didn't tell her parents she was leaving. Or maybe they really thought that this was like a career path for them, and sometimes it's about who you know. She wants to make a good impression, and that'll just take a little longer for her to work hard and turn it into a modeling job. So sometimes it's not, traveling overseas, not completely the same thing, but like sextortion cases, we've had those in Michigan where, they go against kids and sometimes it involves money, sometimes it doesn't, get close with someone, send me this picture, and then all of a sudden I'm going to use it against you. Either send me another picture or send me this money, and that's absolutely terrifying, especially for youth. I'm going to send it across your high school, whatever it is. That works for adults too. At the end of the day, it's blackmail, but those situations do occur. Survival sex is a different one that I don't think a lot of people think about. So this example says a teen who identifies as a queer runs away from home in a small Texas town when his stepfather beats him up for his sexual identity. He camps out in a bus station and meets other runaways who tell him about someone they know in Houston. He'll probably let him stay at the house, but for a price. So the coercion control is that the person who owns the house is very straightforward about the arrangement. The teen can stay there as long as they provide sex to the homeowner and occasionally other friends. The teen does not have any other options for housing and is also seeking a community where he hopes to find with the homeowner. The exit in that one is that the teen meets another young runaway. I cannot read this. The teen meets other young people who have run away. They connect him with a supportive shelter situation, and he returns to school. But, that type of situation is also real. And then exploitation of addiction. This one's in here because we do deal with this a lot. This is, a lot of people have a misunderstanding of addiction. We get why won't they just go to treatment? Why don't they just get clean? Why don't they just say no to drugs? If only it worked that way, we would not have a major substance abuse issue in our country if it did. But addiction completely changes the way your brain functions and how your body reacts to drugs. And so it's not as easy as I'll just stop. Withdrawal is a huge thing. Sometimes withdrawal in the wrong way can kill someone. So you have to go about it carefully. So we get a lot of, I don't say we. In general, I work with a lot of substance abuse cases or mental health. So barriers to reporting, this is one of my favorite slides because this is why data is so inaccurate. One of the big ones is lack of trust in law enforcement. I would not be up here if I didn't trust the law enforcement next to me or Madison Heights, to be honest. I work with a lot of police departments, and this is the one that I'm like, I will always come back to. So the lack of trust in law enforcement is normally from other police departments, whether they've been arrested before or, maybe they've had police come out to their hotel room and they've told them, well, prostitution is illegal, we can arrest you. That type of stuff creates fear. Fear of not being believed, right? Treated like, oh, you're just a prostitute. If you want to go do something else, you could go do it. That's not just from police, that's from anybody. Fear of being arrested. So a decent amount of times we work with people that maybe they have a warrant, maybe they have a record, maybe they were on probation, parole. We have had a case where we had a trafficker who knew someone was on parole and they were like, come down here, I'll take care of you. And then got in the situation, she ended up absconding. So now she's afraid to go back to her parole officer because she's absconded and, is afraid she's going to be blamed for what happened rather than getting the help she needs. So they are smarter than people think when how they find their victims. What can I do to help you? And then they use that against you. Fear of being seen as just a drug addict. That's also a big one. Whether, you don't even have to say those words. It depends on how you react to someone, right? If they tell you, oh, yeah, I use substances, or yeah, I use this drug, and how your body language responds, or oh, poor you, like that stuff does matter. A lot of people don't identify as a victim, and that's okay. They're coached by the trafficker. Maybe they do. If you ever come in contact with police, tell them that you're doing this on your own, and you're making the money, and you make the choices, and, you just want to be left alone. Fear of deportation, language barriers, that's a big one in labor trafficking and sex trafficking cases sometimes. Trauma bond, I say this over Stockholm Syndrome. I know most people know what Stockholm Syndrome is, but a lot of trafficking cases, they're not confined to a small space with the trafficker. So it's not the same thing as Stockholm Syndrome. More or less, they have a trauma bond to the person. And there goes my slideshow. We're going to go from memory now. I know the next slide is, why don't they just leave? Another one of my favorite slides. Thankfully, I know that one. So I want you to, think that you are in a situation where, you have your house, apartment, wherever you are. I drive you 50 miles away and I drop you off, right? You don't have money. You don't have a cell phone. It just died.
Which is a case that we worked together in this exact thing happened, just like
It was my laptop, not you. This is classic technology. Oh, no, it's not dead. It just said it was restarting. IT was like, we're restarting this for you. Maybe it's restarting. We might get there. But yes, so you're in a place you don't know, right? Your cell phone died. Where are you going to charge it if you're in the middle of the street, right? There's no plugs out in the middle of nowhere. You can even think you're in Madison Heights. You don't need to think you're in a rural area. You're just not from here. You don't know the area. You have no money. You're afraid to call your family because they pretty much told you they're done with you because you're just a drug addict and why won't you go get clean? All those situations, right? Maybe you don't know where you are. You don't know where to go. I'm getting there. Just all those questions of why don't they just leave, right? It seems so easy. Why don't they just leave? Why don't they just walk out the door? Well, what if you have like a severe addiction, right? And you're afraid of going into withdrawal? What if you're afraid of going to the hospital because they're going to think you're crazy and they just petition you and send you inpatient? And no one listens to you inpatient because they think you're crazy. All those are actually very real situations. I'm not saying that to be far-fetched. Like, I've run into all these things. And it's okay. I put this slide in there for a reason because I get that question. If they're not chained in the basement or they can walk out the door, why don't they just leave? Another one, where can you go if you have no ID? You can't get on a bus. You can't get on a plane. You can't go to the airport. A lot of times, even to get into substance treatment, you need ID. You need ID to get a lot of social services. Well, how do I know who you are? Because everything needs to be paid for in some way, right? Who can you trust, right? That's a big one. I pretty much covered them all.
I think the big one for us is, what we experience the most is, at some point during that romance phase at the beginning, the trafficker always gets the victim to introduce them to their family. It happens almost every time, and it's something we look for. And they're doing it because the victim is proud of this person that they're with, thinking, I finally found somebody that cares about them. But that's not the reason why the trafficker's doing that. They're doing it because they want, at some point later on, to use it as control that, hey, I know where your family lives, you don't do what I tell you, I'm gonna hurt them. And we get it all the time. And remember, these traffickers are carrying guns. You know, almost every one of our cases, they've had a gun at some point on this person, and this victim or survivor is afraid at some point their family's gonna get harmed. So, I mean, these are all techniques that are being used. I mean, this is really happening out there, and it's happening here. So.
Definitely. And I did forget a few. What if you left and you're hungry and you don't have money? How are you going to get food? Another one, if you're even allowed to take your stuff, how much can you carry with you? Right? You have to, I think a lot of people misunderstand, oh, it's just stuff, throw it away and we'll get you new stuff. But it's like, okay, well, that stuff's been with me for 10 years when no one else has. And so belongings can be really important to people. Oh, no. Okay, we're just going to click this time. So speaking with survivors, again, victims don't typically identify their situation as human trafficking. Even as advocates, we don't ever ask, are you being trafficked? Because most people think of another scenario, right? If you're sex trafficked, you might think, well, I'm not an immigrant, I'm not being labor trafficked, and labor trafficking victims might not even be aware of their rights. They might just be afraid that they're going to be deported. So everyone has their own reason why they don't identify. And our big thing, of course, is if you suspect trafficking, contact your local police department. A lot of people wonder where referrals can come from. Where do we get these cases? So sometimes the victim self-reports. They might not say, hey, I'm being trafficked. They just might say, hey, can you help me get out of the situation? I'm scared. Or I need to get away from so-and-so. I'm in a domestic violence relationship. But then we realize this is more than domestic violence. The victim's friends or family members might be concerned, I think something's going on there. They're not acting normal. I know a recent case at a Southfield, the only reason the police got involved was because ex-boyfriend was like, my ex-girlfriend disappeared. I don't know what's going on. This is not like her. And he contacted the police, and they found her in ads online at a hotel in Southfield. Local, state, and federal law enforcement, whether they identify it before they do anything about it, which is rare, but Madison Heights does it, or it's after the fact. Hospitals can identify it, sometimes attorneys, other community providers, neighbors, coworkers, church members, and then mandated reporters are like your teachers. I think nurses are mandated reporters. They just have different healthcare guidelines. Advocates are mandated reporters, so coaches are mandated reporters. And those are just a few places. This one is interesting, not to be a bummer, just to be a reality of how much more work we need to do to make a difference. This is more or less just statistics on how many survivors or how many victims at the time have crossed through different portals where they could have been identified but were missed. And so they grab data from, hey, did you ever go to the hospital? Were you going to school at the time? Did you ever interact with law enforcement, the child welfare system? And they, check their boxes of, yeah, actually I went through all these things and no one even asked me or no one thought. And so it's just interesting to see, how many times they can cross over before something changes and they either are identified or they identify themselves. So I'll briefly go into what we do at Common Ground. We do have a trafficking program specifically. We have our victim assistance program, which works with every victim of crime except trafficking. And then we have a specific human trafficking program. We do case management more than anything. So yes, we do the court and police accompaniment, but we do a lot beyond that as well. There's 3 advocates, and then we have a supervisor. And this is just a few things that we do. So crisis intervention is a huge one. We do that either it's face-to-face, over the phone, whatever that might look like. That's a pretty common one. Coordinating with shelters, housing agencies. Sometimes we relocate people, whether it's out of county, out of state for their safety. Criminal justice accompaniment. Replacing IDs of all forms. That is a big thing we do. Not a lot of places, we have funding to cover that, thankfully, but normally that is not something that agencies do. They say, well, go in the door, and they're like, well, who are you? And you tell them your name, right, your date of birth, your social. Well, do you have a picture ID? And so we have to get birth certificates, social security cards, state IDs, driver's license, whatever. Sometimes you can use a jail wristband. I've used that before. But you need to be able to prove who you are. Community trainings and outreach, like what we're doing right now. PPOs and police reports, we do those. We collaborate with police, hospitals, and communities. So again, the case management long-term, normally people ask, how long is your average case? Well, there is no average case, but sometimes I work with people for literally 24 hours. And then sometimes I have a couple cases now that are over 2 years. So it really depends. Resources to food, clothing, and shelter. Transportation assistance. We have really bad public transportation, if you didn't know, in Southeast Michigan. So thankfully, we have cars. So each advocate has a vehicle. We can take people to and from court, to appointments. We do emergency response. We help in applying for state and federal assistance. Is that food stamps? Do they need health insurance? Do they need WIC? Do they have children? We help coordinate with psychiatric hospitals and substance treatment because sometimes we do have survivors that need that intensive assistance, and so we'll work with them on that. But our big thing is that we're really individualized. No two victims and survivors are the same, just like none of us in the room are all the same. We have different things that make us unique, and so we're really big on figuring out what each survivor wants to do and achieve, and then that's our path with each person. And then active with motive, which we will talk about. I know the chief brought this up a little bit, but the Sixth Circuit actually does have a human trafficking unit. They are all actually amazing. That's how we got connected in the first place, actually. One of the prosecutors in the unit, I kept getting referrals, I remember, and I was like, where did this case happen? And they were like, Madison Heights. And I was like, what is going on in Madison Heights? But then we realized Madison Heights was like the only, except for maybe one other, the only police department that was actually looking into trafficking. And so that's why we were getting all these victims out of Madison Heights, was because they were actually looking. They are everywhere, but they're not just going to pop up in the police department and say, hi, I'm a victim of trafficking, please help me. So that's how we got connected. But Prosecutor Karen McDonald recognized the close interplay between drug trafficking and human trafficking, given that traffickers use the drug addictions of their victims to gain and maintain control over them. So the unit was created in January of 2021, and I think we got connected in March of 2021, maybe April. But they created their unit. They currently have 3 full-time and 1 part-time assistant prosecutors, and this is old too. This is not updated since October of 22, but they had prosecuted 19 cases of trafficking. And then cases come into the office based on sting operations done by local departments or 911 calls received that precipitated a trafficking investigation. Yeah, probably. Which, again, does not mean that, oh no, Madison Heights is the only place with a trafficking problem. They're just the only place that's actually looking into it, except for maybe one other police department. This is a funny thing, but this makes me smile now. So one of the few things that when we were getting started, we were trying to figure out what can we do to make a difference, right? They were doing the work behind the scenes, but no one was helping the victim. And so you can't expect someone to stick around if all you do is rescue them and then send them on their way. Where? Where are they going? How are they getting there? How are they paying for stuff? How is that supposed to be sustainable? And one of the things that I was like, maybe we should do this, and they went along with it, which was great. This, we don't have a previous picture, but this is like our soft room now. So this used to be... Right, no couches, like randomly like 4 office chairs that I don't know why. Yeah, teamwork. That's your soft room when it's not being used. But this room, we should have had a before picture, but they got it done. So now if, when we would meet with survivors and bring them back to the police department, no one wants to be at the police department anyway.
Prior to this, then we were bringing them into the fishbowl, which was in booking.
Right.
They don't want to be in the fishbowl in booking. They feel like they've been arrested at that point, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yes, because you tell them, come back to the police department. We're not going to arrest you. Okay, why do I need to go to the police department? Right. So this was just something that, with a little bit of paint and some couches from other people, that we were able to fix. And then these are like, if you have kids, most likely these are fidgets. The fidget spinners are old-fashioned now. I found that out when I bought them. They were like, people don't use these anymore. Oh. What is? Oh. I was like, what? But yeah, so these are just random things. Like if the back left corner, there's little cubbies in there. So in the cubbies are like fidgets, these little poppet things, like just things to help with anxiety, right? To sit there, you don't want to, most likely you don't want to be there anyway. You still don't trust most of the things we're saying to you. That takes time. And we know that. And then we have like some adult coloring books and stuff in case they just want to keep busy.
I think I'd like to mention, I think I was talking to, was I talking to you about it earlier? Before I met Allie, when I would bring somebody back to the PD, I was looking at a minimum of 4 hours to get somebody into a program. And logistically, it was just a nightmare. And I was beating my head against the wall. I mean, I was going home so angry that I couldn't even sleep because we would put all this work into trying to rescue somebody. You hate that word, but
You guys do rescue people.
we do. Rescue people, bring them back to the PD, put all this work into it, put this huge investigation to it, only to have this person sit there and within, because you have a limited window. If they're an addict, they're going to start getting sick, okay? And once they're sick, most programs won't take them then. So the clock is ticking. I'm on the phone. I'm being asked questions. I mean, I would tell Allie stories about this if they were Native American. What does that matter at this point? Why are we asking these ridiculous questions? I need to get this person some help. And most of the time I would lose them halfway through this process. They would either tell me, they'd be so sick I had to get them to the hospital, or they'd say, I can't do this, I gotta leave. Because, I mean, take the flu and multiply that by 100, or the sickest you've ever been and multiply, that's being dope sick. And, I mean, we've just got to get over this. We've got to get over this, that this person's a drug addict. Nobody wants to be a drug addict, none of them, they don't. They're dealing with they're coping with most of the time with some prior trauma in their life. That's why they went to the drugs, so.
Right. And I think a big thing too is, just because we have an advocate in our group now doesn't mean that all of a sudden, oh, you need a shelter? Great. Well, there's an opening. Oh, you need substance treatment? Well, that's easy. It's still very difficult, unfortunately, to get people help. But the one thing we can always guarantee people is you're not going to do it alone, right? Like law enforcement is supposed to be focusing on their job. They're not supposed to be social workers. I'm not supposed to be law enforcement. We're separate roles, but when we work together, it makes things a lot better. And honestly, me being able to say to survivors, listen, I work with this police department all the time. I trust them, and I mean that, means a lot, right? And I don't say that about every law enforcement. I'm not going to say it unless I mean it, because that's a big thing. You have to be honest with them. I don't know everything, but I'll tell you what I do know, or I'll go find the answer. And so, we don't make promises we can't keep, because all that does is break trust. But being able to work together, that's what has been most helpful. Like, I don't even remember how I did my job as an advocate before I worked with law enforcement so well, honestly. It makes things that much easier. Doesn't mean that they want to go testify. Doesn't mean that they want to see their trafficker, but it does mean, hey, I've seen you before, I trust you, it seems like you really care about me and listen to me, and that makes a big difference.
And we train in our place too. I mean, I train officers under me on these same techniques because I'm going to be honest with you, I'm somewhat ashamed. It's not just the general public, it's law enforcement as well. Sometimes we ignore the signs. Sometimes I think we have an approach out there sometimes that, it's a prostitute, they choose to do it. We got to stop thinking that way. So I mandated some training not too long ago through MSP, and everybody had to take it. And it's got to start somewhere. We've got to make a change. So.
Right. So this is actual, in the beginning when we first started working together, we were big on, we need to show that this is doing something to make a difference. And so we actually started keeping feedback from survivors. So anytime they would give me like a quote or something, I actually wrote it down. And so these are some of what we got. So you keeping your word means everything, because no one ever does that for me. And that doesn't mean, us keeping our word that everything's positive. Like sometimes we keep our word, but it didn't go the way we planned. And that's okay, because you were truthful about it. I didn't know services like yours existed. This one is about him. You're the first cop who I feel like actually cares about me as a person. If you both didn't come out there to show me that you cared, I don't think you would have come back. There's a long story behind that one. But thankfully we got the support we had a survivor that wasn't from the area, but we identified in Madison Heights. And she did end up going back further north when she felt like she couldn't do it.
We're going to show you that video, just a quick video.
I can pull it up. That's fine.
Just the clip of how that started, so everybody in the room understands if they're looking for something, if they feel that there's something odd going on in a particular situation, it's as simple as what we're gonna show you. And that could spark an investigation and possibly get somebody some help.
Right. So this, you have to be innovative with how you do certain things in this field in general. And so we asked for approval to go up to where this survivor was because we were like, listen, maybe if we talk with her and let her know we still care about her, we want to help her, maybe she'll come back. So we drove up there. We did run into her. We let her know we still cared about her. We weren't judging her for leaving. And one of her big things was, honestly, I was embarrassed to call you guys because I thought you'd be disappointed in me. We were like, nope, not disappointed. We just want you to know we're here. She didn't come back with us that night, but 5 days later, she called us and said, okay, I'm ready to come back. And so we had never done that before, but I'm really glad that we did because she's doing amazing now. Yes. And then just the last one was I was close to giving up on everything. I didn't think my life was worth living anymore, and you made me feel like I mattered. So we're getting close to the end, but this is just a big thing to remember. Compliance is not consent. So just because it looks like they're going along with something doesn't mean that they, in their head, are saying, yes, I want to do this. And then this is just kind of a spectrum of it, but the big thing, which actually we don't have a slide in here, human trafficking is a business. It's insane how much money these traffickers make. People don't realize that it really is about money and greed. And, you know, it's a true example, even though it's sad to say, like, you can only sell a drug once, right? Once it's consumed, it's gone. People can be sold over and over and over again.
Days a week, that's generally what they work.
And then this is just a, oh, go ahead.
I just had a question. Is there any connection with trafficking and the people that we see on our street corners, you know, holding up their signs and panhandling? Is there any connection between those?
You know, we haven't made that connection, generally, but I could see that happening, sure, at some point. It depends on if they ever get approached by the right person. But, yeah, it
Right.
definitely could happen. But we have not had a case where we've started with somebody that was panhandling on the corner. But we've started cases where somebody at a hotel seen begging for money outside of the room, because remember, the victim is not getting any money. They're getting zero. They're getting drugs when they need it in limited quantities, and when the trafficker does step out for a second, that's generally when, this is a sign to look for, and you'll see it, the victim will generally step away and even beg for money just to get something additional in their life, maybe more drugs or maybe some food. So that we have started cases based on begging for money, but not from the street corner.
Thank you.
So just something to think about. Just because it's the first time you're hearing the story doesn't mean it's the first time being told to someone. And this is not just for trafficking. This goes for anyone telling you anything related to trauma in general. But based on how you respond or react, you might be the last person they decide to disclose to, right? How many times has someone said, well, I told so many people about my abuse as a child. No one believed me, or no one listened, or, you know, maybe I went to that person that I thought, sometimes we get it with parents too, but, you know, oh, that didn't happen. And then they never tell anyone again because that trusted person didn't believe them. Or they responded with, well, are you sure you didn't have anything to do with that? It's just be very aware of how you respond when people tell you things, because that verbal or, you know, judgment in general based on body language can really matter. So positive steps forward. The Attorney General's office has a human trafficking task force for Michigan, and they're currently attempting to try and work on accurate data representation in trafficking. Though more or less the quality of services matters, in order to get funding for anything, you need to have numbers. Why should we fund this? How big of a problem is it? And so the AG's office is working on that. We did talk about the prosecutor's office. The Sixth Circuit has a trafficking unit. They are working on sentencing additional charges outside of trafficking to build stronger cases and increase sentencing guidelines. Survivor to Thriver is an initiative that the Oakland County Human Trafficking Task Force started, where service agencies working with survivors can submit essentially applications for funding for things that aren't essential. So a lot of people, I've worked with survivors that they've never been to the zoo and they grew up in Metro Detroit. Like they haven't gone to the movies in 5 years. So they're not essential needs on purpose. They're to remind people, that life is more about surviving. So state funding doesn't exist for that. So the county has put some money towards things like that that might seem small to us or normal to us that other people haven't had the chance to do ever or in a long time. Motive is what we created our task force to be identified as, and it stands for the Michigan Ops Team Investigating Violent Exploitation. You can take the next one. Collaboration with Semtech.
I mean, I think motive is still, temporarily not in play now, but we hope to get back to that. But we definitely wanted an identifier for ourselves because what we were facing was when we would rescue a victim, we had to start this process of dealing with the courts because almost every time they had a multitude of warrants. So instead of just calling up and saying, hey, this is Allison Mercer from Common Ground, we could actually identify as a legitimate task force. And it seemed to work for us. It got us some more polls. So that's one of the reasons why we created that. Semtech, yeah, that's, Chief, should we talk about that now or just? We are forming a collaboration with Semtech. Semtech is a federal human trafficking group. So we are partnering with them here sometime in the near future, and we're going to be doing some part-time work with them. So just having that federal arm at our disposal is going to be huge because there's a lot of things they can do. They have equipment that we don't have, and it will just make our job that much easier.
And then the last couple, Sanctum House is one of the trafficking residential programs that we have in Southeast Michigan. Some good news is that they received some additional funding, so now they can expand their program. And then Prism Project is a new agency. I believe they just opened in October of last year, where they actually are the first minor residential program specified to taking trafficking survivors. They do have to go through foster care, but normally minors, anyway they're trafficked, are mandated to be reported. So that's the first one that opened up in Michigan, which is sad but needed. And then we're almost done. A lot of people ask about funding. So Common Ground, we're specifically grant funded, thankfully for now. Every year is a new grant cycle, and there's a new chance every year that we don't get our grant. Maybe they allocate money somewhere else. Maybe they don't want to specialize in trafficking. So we're funded through October 1st of 2024, and then after that we have to apply again. So we are not federally funded, but we're state funded. We don't do this alone. Like I might be a case manager, but Common Ground doesn't offer all the services that every survivor could ever need. And so we have to work with other community partners. Sometimes we have MOUs, sometimes we don't. Thankfully, we have a good relationship with Salvation Army. They tried to do something. We use them as an example of what not to do, essentially, because they received a state grant between Salvation Army and the Michigan State Police. They completely disbanded. It did not work. They lost their funding, but they got private donations that people were saying, we want this to go to trafficking survivors. But Salvation Army no longer has a program for trafficking survivors. So thankfully, they give us some miscellaneous funding so we can do those things that aren't grant funded, which includes food, which I know is really weird because food is an essential need, but state grants do not allow us to buy food for people unless we take them to court and it's like lunch during court. I don't get it. And then Survivor to Thriver is that one initiative that I brought up. We're done.
Do you want to show that quick clip if you can?
Yes. Let me see if I can disconnect.
Get an idea of something. I don't want to go into too many details about how we investigate these crimes. It's just stuff that I'd like to keep somewhat secret. But I do want you to see